This movie begins a series on the Knitsmart knitting machine. It's the same gauge as the Bond, and in many ways the machines are almost alike. The carriage of the Knitsmart machines is a little bit heavier and more elaborate, but they do use key plates. Each key plate is two-sided, so if it says 35 on one side, it says 30 on the other, and those represent two different stitch sizes. There are 4 key plates starting with 10 and going to 45, so that's 8 stitch sizes. I have heard, but have not checked for myself, that Bond key plates will work in a Knitsmart carriage. The system is modular, so any number of bed pieces can be snapped together, and it came in various sizes of setup. The needles are held in their slots by plastic retaining bars. The one you see here has broken in 2, but it still does work. There's a very simple sponge strip above the needles and below the retaining bar. This cuts down on the rattling of the needles on a simple machine like this. The one on this machine is pretty well worn out, and I'm going to find something to replace it with while we work on this series of movies. The Knitsmart machines came with an outstanding manual. I already knew how to machine knit when I first got a hold of one, so I can't be certain, but I really think that you could completely learn to knit following these instructions in this manual. However, since I already had machine knitting skills, I combine skills that I learned other places with what is taught in this manual, and you will see me do those things in this video series. I'm going to show you some basics of casting on in this movie. Here you see me doing the E-wrap that is a common cast on in machine knitting. I have a whole video on learning to do this precisely, so I won't belabor the point here. The E-wrap sort of works on a Knitsmart machine, but not perfectly, and it's really better to start and waste yarn, which I'll show you in a minute, and then you get the results you truly want. I'm using a cast-on comb here from an HK100. That's a Singer knitting machine. The gauge is correct, and it's very helpful. More about that comb in a minute. This machine has no setting that allows it to knit back from the hold position, so we need to move to upper working position to knit. And it did knit across, but because of the nature of the machine, it dropped a few stitches. So here is a much more foolproof way to utilize that comb. We can't knit back from all the way forward, so select every other needle, place them into working position or upper working position, and knit across with some waste yarn. Of course, no stitches will form, but each needle that is forward will catch a loop. Then if you hang the comb, it will hold those loops down. After that, if the remainder of the needles come to normal working position or upper working position, stitches will begin to form. This is not a pretty edge. It's a great start for waste yarn, and it can also be used as a drawstring edge if you have the need. The first row will be stiff with the comb in position. After that, it gets very simple and foolproof, and if you have a drop stitch at the beginning, you can manually fix it as you see me doing here. We don't care since this is just the waste yarn, and that is a tool, not a part of the project. So it doesn't matter if the initial edge is problematic. Once every stitch is knitted and knitting smoothly, there is rarely any more problem. The machine knits like a dream. Very smooth. And it's not something that you should move to and fro fast. That is true of all knitting machines to some extent, and hobby machines in particular. The needles need time for their latches to close and for you to allow them to respond. So this is a real normal knitting pace, and the machine can produce a lot of fabric like that. Perfect. That swatch is just what we hope to achieve. Now let's cast on with the main yarn using the E-wrap stitch, and everything will go perfectly. You could knit in a row of elastic thread as the Bond instructs you to do after the hem, or a row of ravel cord. I don't have any handy, so I'm skipping that step and it'll work out fine. Now, E-wrapping all the way across, keeping one hand under the work to make sure that wraps don't get too tight. That's part of the secret. And of course, we began with a knotted loop on the left and the carriage on the right. If E-wrapping is not working well for you, the reason for new knitters is almost always that they have wrapped too tightly. From the forward position, we must go to upper working position and knit the first couple rows carefully, and after that, it's a piece of cake. Like the bond, this machine requires that you knit from a loose yarn supply. Mine is behind the machine, on the other side of the machine from where I'm sitting, and that you take up the slack manually after knitting each row. In this case, I'm driving the carriage with my right hand, and my left hand is off camera, ready to lift at the end of every row. On a fancier machine, this is done with the tensioning assembly. Here's how the key plates fit into the carriage, which is a two-part carriage. All of the key plates look very similar, but each has a slightly different length of needle path, and that is what gives the different stitch sizes. The distance that the needles travel is a little bit different. That causes one to pull back a little bit more yarn into the stitch than the other. If you align two key plates, you may be able to spot the difference, even though they're fine gradations. It's not real easy to spot. And here it goes back into the two-part carriage. The yarn feeder works the same as the one on the bond, though it is a little fancier. The smooth plastic lining does improve the way the yarn feeds in my experience. Up to now, I've been knitting with key plate 30 using number 4 yarn, which is pretty typical. Now let's try key plate 45 with number 5 yarn. The first row is a little bit stiff as the thicker yarn feeds through the smaller stitches, but after that, it goes beautifully. Plastic machines, on the whole, don't do their best work at their extremes of stitch size. This one is something of an exception. The largest key plate and number 5 yarn produce a pretty nice fabric, and they don't make any fuss about it. The fabric is nice. It's not a terrible amount of work to accomplish. You may have noticed that my needles don't align perfectly at the end of every row. It looks snaggletooth, but it's been that way as long as I've owned this machine, and it has not created a problem. When we look at the fabrics, we have two very presentable bulky fabrics. I don't see any difference between them and fabrics knitted on my other bulky machines. Patterns designed using stockinette stitch for other bulky machines work perfectly well on this machine. Here's how we release the waste yarn in the absence of a ravel cord or elastic thread. Snip it on each end and then just pull it out. That will leave our nice E-wrapped cast-on edge as a tidy beginning to the piece of knitting. Now, a little bit more about those combs I'm using. I like them because you saw how neatly they work, and they also add a little bit of weight to the knitting without hanging any extras. But they accept extra weight if you need it to control the fabric. I find them quicker and more reliable in performance than the hem. But in another video, I will show you how to create your own hem if you would prefer to do that. My combs came with a machine like this. It's an HK100, a Singer product with 8mm needle spacing. Combs like mine will be very difficult to find, but I was delighted to discover some almost just like them on the Chris Crafter website for bond knitters. Because the gauges are the same, if you own a Knitsmart, those combs should work for you. Throughout this movie, you've been watching me work with a repaired carriage. It looked like this before we started. So the next movie will be on making some repairs to this machine. Then we'll move on to other knitting techniques and a project. If you have a Knitsmart and you want to try a sweater, I recommend this one. It's a free video series in 8 parts. This is a screenshot of where I announced the knit along. I think your likeliest key plate for successfully matching the gauge is the 30, and I will place a link to the playlist in the program notes for this video.